Now, before I begin this video, I have only one question to ask you, and your ability to answer this question correctly will determine whether you will understand this video or not. Now listen, if you have a very beautiful farmland that is flourishing at every single season, but then you cannot cultivate that farmland on your own, and there is only one laborer that you have that has been helping you to cultivate that farmland, would you easily allow that laborer to go, even if the highest authority in the world commands you to let him go? Well, perhaps you may do otherwise, but it will be a very tough decision for you to make. You may let him go, but not really easily. And it will be even more difficult if you are a greedy person. You may initially pretend that you have always wanted the best for the laborer and you will just easily let him go. But then you will start to think about your farmland and your business. Honestly, there are a lot of questions that will be running into your head at that very moment. What if I couldn't find any other laborer just like him? What if he leaves and your business dies since you cannot do it on your own? This scenario is exactly what it looks like during the time of the transatlantic slave trade between the Europeans and the Africans in the late decades of 18th century, when popular voices opposing the slave trade increased, requesting for the abolition of the inhuman acts of slave trade. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade birthed the Industrial Revolution. Now back to the farmland. Some of those questions running into your head as the owner of the farmland, there are some of the reasons why some of the European countries did not easily accept the abolition of the slave trade. They obviously knew what they are going to lose if the transatlantic slave trade was finally abolished. And that was why it took so many more years for the transatlantic slave trade to come to an end, even when the law was already made. For the perpetrators of the slave trade, letting it go will require them to make tough decisions. If the slaves were emancipated, how are they going to work their plantations and their mines? They knew that the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade will affect the world's economy in general. And it was clear that the more slaves they have in the workforce, the more there will be economic upswing because slave trade directly or indirectly contributed to the nation's GDP. But here's the thing, late in the 1880s, while most European countries and Americas were very hesitant of letting go of the trade, they refused to really think outside the box and even to pay attention to what is coming ahead, which was the Industrial Revolution. The transatlantic slave trade made the world lazy. In Africa, for example, people actually left their farm just to focus on the lucrative business of capturing and selling slaves to the Europeans and the Portuguese slave merchants, because that was the present gold rush. While also in Europe, instead of people to focus on the mechanical leverage that could be developed to make work and life easier, they abandoned that and rather prefer the use of human beings in the mines and plantation. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade opened up another chapter in human history that enabled human beings to double down on figuring out ways of doing hard labor without necessarily using human beings as slaves. So now we will put it this way: if the transatlantic slave trade was not abolished, there wouldn't have been anything like the Industrial Revolution, because the use of machines came to replace what human beings are being forced to do. Now, here is one of the things that used to baffle me anytime I'm researching about the transatlantic slave trade. And if you've been following to this stage, you may still be wondering about this same question, which is why the Europeans didn't enslave themselves. Someone said that the Europeans couldn't work on their farms and their mines even if they wanted to, and still couldn't be able to work even if they were forced to. But now the truth is, in the beginning, the Europeans had been working on their farms by themselves. But as the demand for slaves increased on the tropical part of America, where the climate was too hot for the Europeans to do heavy work on the open field, most American Indians were enslaved and forced to work very hard on those farms and mines of Mexico and Peru. These slaves were badly treated, and due to they were not strong in body, many of them died. At that moment, that was when it became very necessary to find more slaves that would take the place of the dead ones. The death of these slaves were what made the Europeans to realize that if their native people were unfit to do the hard work in the mines and plantations, no better slaves could be found than the African Negroes. And only that singular decision was what birthed the epidemic that we know today as the Transatlantic slave trade, which nearly destroyed the Negroes and the Indians' populations. Okay, now that we have understood the struggles and why the Europeans do not enslave themselves and why they rather enslave the African Negroes as they were carrying out their trade, I think it's time for us to understand how long it took for the transatlantic slave trade to be abolished. How long it took to abolish the transatlantic slave trade in the world. Economically, the transatlantic slave trade was viable. It made the world to be productive, but at the same time, it diminished the population of the world. And for the fact that it enhanced the world's productivity was what made it difficult for the abolishment to work immediately. But despite the economic advantage of the slave trade, humanitarianism prevailed over economic self-interest. Now we have to understand that making law to abolish the slave trade and also actually abolishing the slave trade are two different things. Now you have to ask yourself, did those wicked Africans stop capturing their fellow brothers and selling them to the white men just because law was made against the slave trade? Or did the Europeans suddenly say, alright, we are no more buying slaves from you people because a law has been made against the slave trade? But neither of these two things really happened. To put an end for a cause that has been around for centuries, we know it's going to take time, effort, and of course hard work, tremendous hard work. The law to abolish the slave trade was made at the end of the 18th century, but the illegal slave trade still went on even till the 19th century, taking different time to different countries that could abolish the transatlantic slave trade. For example, it took Britain about 18 good years before the bill could be passed just to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. That was in the 1803. But despite that, the trade still went on in the British colony even till the 1833. And even at that, a full emancipation was not realized until 1838. Sweden outlawed the transatlantic slave trade in the 1813. Denmark was the first country to abolish slave trade in 1803. The United States banned slave trade in 1808. Netherlands in 1814. France outlawed slave trade for the second time in 1814. Now finally, Brazil, according to history, was the last country to emancipate its enslaved people. Now before you go, I have a question for you, which is, if the transatlantic slave trade was in today's world, how long do you think it would take for it to be abolished? Tell me what you think in the comment below. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you for your time and for your effort for still sticking around with me to this end. Thank you so much, and I will see you again. This video was inspired by my book, The Mind of a Hero. Catch up in the link below to get a copy, the soft copy or the hard copy. But still remain my name, Chinoso Aguze, and I'll see you again in the next video. Peace. Bye bye.